Good afternoon, everybody. Christ is in our midst. Welcome to the next installment of our book study. We're doing The Trial of Job by Father Patrick Henry Reardon. And today we'll be tackling chapters 20 through 25. So, as usual, we're going to jump right in. And those of you out there watching virtually, feel free to chime in with your questions and answers, and we'll do the best to acknowledge them and answer them if we can. So here we go. Starting in chapter 20, how does Father Patrick describe the character arc of Job relative to that of his comforters?
Okay. His mind grows richer, he examines ideas and perceptions more critically, and finds fresh paths of reflection, living his profession of faith.
Okay. His insights grow deeper. He continues to reflect on things, to learn. And what is happening to his interlocutors?
Yeah.
Yes. The people he's talking to.
Don't bring those big words. Those small words, please.
They're just repeating what they're saying.
Yes. And
Thought processes decline, become louder.
right. There's less thinking and more shrieking going on as we get to this point. What we've seen with the sort of the general movement of Job is that it's like these dialogues are like a wheel. The same thing happens over and over again, just in a slightly different place. It's like a wheel rolling forward. And as that happens, really this is an epitome of Scripture itself. It's one of the ways in which Job is reflective of a much larger picture. This is the way Scripture works. With a number of its most prominent themes, like priesthood, kingship, sacrifice, you'll see a story that presents those themes in a particular way. And sometimes the story will be very condensed, very short. And then you'll see that story, a different sort of story that takes up some of those same themes in a different place, and it might be condensed or it might be longer. But it will nuance your understanding of the first story, or it will say something a little bit different, and so your understanding of the concept broadens a little bit. So Job is that way. They repeat these dialogue cycles, and after a while the comforters don't have anything interesting or new to say, and they have come so far as to be reduced to simply trying to insult Job in the most vile possible ways to get their point across. So there's nothing new coming from them, nothing insightful or helpful. They have come from the highest point of Eliphaz's first interaction with Job, all the way down now to where it's just terrible. But all the time they have been rehearsing the same sort of arguments over and over again. Whereas Job, as he rehearses them, probes them in slightly different ways. Sometimes he's meditative. Sometimes he's prayerful. Sometimes he's declarative. Sometimes he asks questions. Sometimes he's despairing. Sometimes he's very hopeful. So we get a sense that the richness of Job's character and of Job's inner life is not only being revealed, but is actually being brought to be by virtue of the fact that God has not answered his questions yet. We're actually seeing Job's character being formed here as he continues to probe, continues to seek, but isn't getting any answers. So Job is getting deeper and richer in the context of his suffering, and his comforters in the context of their comfort. So there's an irony in the name. Are becoming smaller and smaller. Uglier, more petty, and more petty. What does Zophar's last speech reveal about himself? You know, sometimes when someone talks, you may not learn much about the topic they're talking about, but you might learn an awful lot about them. So, when Zophar gives this last dialogue of his in chapter 20, what's Zophar telling you about himself?
He doesn't have much to say.
He doesn't have much to say. But that doesn't stop him from saying it very, very loudly.
Well, he doesn't have any more insight to give.
And Zophar never really had any to
No.
give in the first place.
He never did.
But Father Patrick points out that Zophar's speech here is bookended by two of Job's fine speeches, his very fine speeches. And literally, this heightens the contrast. We can see the contrast here between the lowness that his comforters have come to and the richness, the depth, if not the exaltation, of Job's character itself. Zophar is revealing here how little he ever had to offer. Whereas with Eliphaz, we see a fall from grace by virtue of the fact that he's unwilling to learn more than he already knows. What we see here is that Zophar simply veneered over, in his first speech, the ugliest of his vulgarities, the worst of his rudeness, his pettiness, his smallness.
This speech versus the other one.
His first speech, yes. So if we go back to when he spoke the first time, Zophar is revealing that there was never really anything there with him to begin with. So one wonders why it is that he bothered to come in the first place. Because we're doing more chapters today, we're doing fewer questions on each chapter. We're reaching the end of this back and forth part of the book, where Job is going back and forth with his friends, and we're entering into a new part of it. From here on until God shows up, we're going to be seeing a lot of Job and not so much of his comforters anymore. But you want to file away in the back of your mind just how ugly it got before they stopped talking, because that's going to be important by the end. Are there any other questions on chapter 20? Yeah.
The last section, the last two sentences rather, is the present chapter is Zophar's perverted fantasy of what evil man Job must have been and what terrible divine judgment awaits him. It all sounds more ridiculous and improbable because it so closely follows on the grandeur of Job's aspirations in the previous chapter. Speaking of the aspirations, what's that in relation to, I guess?
So in chapter 19, Job has given this full-throated expression of his confidence and his hope in the vindication of God. That God will vindicate him, that God will prove him in the right, and that all his hope, all his trust is in God, that God is his strength, his life, his salvation. So Job is giving this very wholehearted and thorough declaration of his faith in God. And then the very next chapter, Zophar is like, you know, now that we've had a chance for you to really talk, we see you really must be an evil, wicked person who deserves everything you get. How could you have heard what Job said in 19 and respond to it that way? There's something perverse in that. It's a blindness that leads one to almost a shocking ugliness. Any other questions on chapter 20? So moving on to chapter 21. How does Job's criticism of his friend's theodicy work? And I'll just remind you here real quickly that the word theodicy is a fancy $5 theology word for reflection that is intended to explain the meaning of suffering. So Job's friends have a particular perspective that and particular beliefs they use to explain the meaning of Job's suffering. And not just in relationship to Job, but they have a perspective that is one that's a rule for everybody. So Job, first of all, what is their explanation for Job's suffering? We've been over it and over it.
He did something wrong.
Job
and
sinned.
He deserves to have
Job
God's
sinned,
punishment.
and God punishes the unjust, and that's why he's in the pickle he's in.
Yeah.
This is a way of explaining suffering. It's not a very good way of explaining suffering. It's actually rather a poor way of explaining suffering, but it is nonetheless the way that it works for them. And so this is their theodicy. How do we justify things? How do we justify the suffering in the world? How do we justify God in the face of that suffering? Well, if it's only the unrighteous, then God is nothing more than just affirming what is the moral order of the world. Easy peasy, no problem. So this is a kind of theodicy, a rudimentary one, but one nonetheless. So how is it that Job criticizes his friend's theodicy? What does he offer as a rebuttal to that perspective on the meaning of suffering?
Okay. Nobody can speak for God.
Nobody can speak for God, but he also offers counterexamples.
Yeah.
He offers quite a few of them. It says here in chapter 21, if everything is just as you say it is, then how is it that you can all think of unrighteous men who have been blessed with children and houses and good crops? How is it that we can all think of righteous men who have had children die, or who have had bad crops, or who have had tragedy befall them? How is it that those things can happen? If your rule is so all-fired great and everything works just the way you say it does, then how is this possible? So his theodicy, Job's rebuttal of their theodicy, is to offer counterexamples that make the rule not consistent. It isn't happening in every case that the righteous are being blessed or that the unrighteous are being punished. So how is the rule working then? How do we make sense of that? That's the question that he puts to them. So what does Job's criticism accomplish?
Don't make me answer all these questions.
You don't have to answer
Somebody
them all.
pipe up.
Job's criticism accomplishes the undermining of these very mechanical and oversimple explanations of the moral order of the world. But it doesn't offer an alternative. In other words, he's saying your system, the way you guys are explaining all of this, doesn't make sense. And here's why it doesn't make sense. And then he ticks off the examples that he's thinking of that undermine the order that they are arguing for. And so then where that leaves him is in a position where the order that they're arguing for has been sort of rebuked intellectually, rationally, but nothing else has been put in its place. And this particularly, it makes Job's comforters really unhappy.
Is that why they leave?
Everybody likes it when the rules are real clear, and if I play by the rules, then I'm going to get my reward, right? All I have to do is tick the boxes, and then I get my candy, and everything is real clear, and it makes it real easy to identify the good ones and the bad ones, the right ones and the wrong ones, the ones I like and the ones I avoid, right? If you got real clear lines like that, then everything is real good, and it's easy to know where you stand. Without those, it's a little bit harder.
It's like a Joel Osteen, you will be blessed, you will have cars.
Not quite so much. But it's, there is something disconcerting in his rebuke, in that it undermines the only system being offered, but offers nothing in its place. And so then we're left kind of in the lurch, twisting in the wind. What is the moral order of the world? How do we understand the suffering of the righteous? What sense do we make of it? How is all of this hanging together? What kind of theological thinking about God does Job's questioning here and his undermining of their system discourage?
Well, sometimes prosperity makes men ungodly, and death befalls all men. Okay, but I really love the last part where it said that these people, the ungodly, will rot in their graves. I thought that was a real good touch. Just had to get that out.
Yeah. You said earlier you don't get to speak for God.
Mm-hmm.
And Father Patrick has pointed out a number of times that what the comforters always want to do is speak for God, as they are proclaiming the indisputable and inviolable law of God when they respond to Him. So it's not possible to get round behind God and then puppet Him. You can't speak for Him. You can't do that kind of thing. The kind of theological thinking that reduces everything to a very simple, oversimple black and white rule that applies equally in every possible situation. Job is going to probe and say that this isn't working. It doesn't make any sense at all. Now, of course, he is coming from the subjective vantage point that he knows he has not done anything to grieve God. So he knows he's not guilty. But of course, this subjective experience can be applied more broadly. And that makes it difficult to speak in unequivocal and absolute generalizations when it comes to matters of suffering and the will of God. What is the will of God as it's expressed in the world? Very hard to generalize about that.
I thought it was really interesting because Job is developing this resurrection idea because he is a righteous man. And you've got that versus the unrighteous, which will not have a resurrection. Judgment, but not a resurrection. They'll just rot in their graves. Neat. I like it.
Is there anything else from chapter 21?
It seems to me that Job is calling out these guys, these comforters. He's calling their bluff, I guess. He keeps pointing out how they are making unanswerable arguments. For instance, when he talks about how the unrighteous are profiting, he says, you say how can it be that this evil man is profiting? He then refers to the argument of his opponents. He says, you say God is reserving his punishment for his sons. In other words, the people that he's arguing with refuse to look at the world the way it is, and instead they say, well, in the next generation, his sons will be punished. And then on the next page, verse 27, this is chapter 21, 27, and it says, this is Job talking. He says, oh, I know your thoughts and the tactics you will devise against me. You will say, where is the house of the great man? So he's talking about the arguments that are being made against him, and he's saying, you can't answer these arguments. The same way that Eliphaz, or one of the other guys I forget early on, Eliphaz has this dream that says, man is always wrong. You can't justify yourself before God. Well, how do you argue with that? Job says, but I'm right. Eliphaz says, no, I have this dream that says man is always wrong. And the other accusers say the same thing. You're always wrong. All you have to do is just beg for forgiveness, and then everything will be all right. So, what am I trying to say here? It seems like that's the reason why the argument keeps going around and around in circles, is that no matter what evidence Job brings forward, the answer is always, that can't be true. And there's just no way to answer that kind of argument. In the end, he says, I want to see God. I know that there's going to be a last judgment, and God will appear on earth and will settle all of this, but I want justice now. And he's not willing to accept the notion that justice will come in the next generation or justice will come at the end of the world. He wants it right in the here and now.
Yeah. And his argument, it's interesting. I mean, anybody who's ever argued with someone sufficiently vituperous knows that
Okay, small word.
Someone who is stubborn and obstinate and just is never going to let it go, anybody who's argued with somebody like that knows that it doesn't matter what evidence you put forward, what counter-arguments you offer. If they can't answer them, they'll just change the game. They'll move the goalposts. They'll shift the field in some way. And it never ends. And we see that here. Job keeps producing the arguments. And you're right. They don't see the world the way that it is. They're seeing it through the lens of an ideal and trying to make it fit. But that's not Cinderella's slipper. Are there any other questions on chapter 21? Comments? So moving on to chapter 22, what is happening to Eliphaz?
Well, I think Father Patrick is too hard on old Eliphaz. That's what I think. He says Eliphaz is becoming more and more strident. He's using more and more vituperative language. But if you go to the end of chapter 22, it sounds like he has Job's best interests at heart. He's telling him, he says all of these things about how Job, I think that you must really be guilty, which Job doesn't agree with. But in the end, he says, be close to him and wholehearted. Good things will come to you thereby. Accept instruction from his mouth. Lay up his words in your heart. If you return to Shaddai, you will be restored. If you banish iniquity from your tent, if you regard treasure as dirt. He goes on and says, for he saves the humble. He will deliver the guilty. He will be delivered through the cleanness of your hands. In the end, I don't come away from that with the notion that he's just getting angry and cussing him out and saying all these terrible things to him. It seems to me that he really believes what he's saying, and he thinks his advice is that if you just repent, God will undo all of these terrible things that have happened to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. They almost always. It's almost like a pattern. Wherever the speech goes, in the beginning and the middle, it always ends up at this expression of the possibility of redemption. Job's speeches, when he says, I wish I was dead, I don't want to live anymore, it'd be better if I'd never been born, my suffering is so unbearable. He'll say all of that, and really, he's really feeling it. But at the end of it, he'll always come back and say, and yet I know, yet I hope, yet I believe that God is righteous, and God will vindicate me, God will give me life, and God will restore me. So there's something of a pattern of that going on here. Eliphaz seems to have forgotten his experience, though. His speech doesn't reflect the kind of mature reflection that he offered early on.
Sometimes when you have an argument, you just break it down to you're a stupid so-and-so, You just run out of intelligent things to say.
Yeah.
It kind of looks like he's running down.
But I think he does introduce a new idea here. In the very beginning, he says, does Shaddai gain if you are righteous? Does he profit if your conduct is blameless? So he's not just asking the question, or he's not just saying God will punish all evildoers, but he's asking the question, what does God gain from people? What do we have that we can give to him? And that's an idea that hasn't been discussed up until this point, I would say.
Interesting. Interesting. How do you think he would answer that question?
Boy, that's a good question. I don't know.
That's why you're here. You have the answers.
That's right.
I can't speak for Eliphaz any more than Eliphaz can speak for God.
Well, if you go back to the introduction, if we take the note, we start from the premise here. God does gain something from people being righteous, right? That's what we're told in the very beginning. What does he gain? I don't know. He boasts to the devil. He says, "Look at my servant Job." And so it sounds like there is some, I don't know, pleasure, or
Right.
joy, or benefit.
On a literary and rhetorical level, in other words, for those who have the benefit of being able to see the story as a whole, the righteous man is a thumb in the eye of the devil, of the accuser, proof that he does not have his will as he wishes. But there's also, and we talked about this a little bit before, the notion of priestly offering. A righteous man offering the offerings for his family brings God close to the world. He pulls, a righteous man offering priestly offering pulls heaven and earth close together. And so God's blessing is called down on the earth where a righteous man offers that priestly offering, that priestly sacrifice. And so Job, as a priest, as a righteous priest, blesses the whole land by virtue of his righteous offering. So there is, in an immediate and also in a literary sense, something to be gained, and you might even say gained for God, gained by God, that there be a righteous man in the land. Even though we are, long before the notion that a righteous man becomes then a kind of an evangelical witness of the possibility of another man, converting or something like that. We're before that. But he's definitely a witness to his God and calls down that grace where he is and sanctifies that land. And that's an important thing in the ancient world. So I think there is something. And I think I detect in what you very insightfully point out about Eliphaz, that note that Job has a service to offer that is important, that is valuable to God, and Eliphaz is trying to call him back to it. If only Job will admit that he has done wrong and repent. Anything else on chapter 22? All right then, let's move on to chapter 23, where we have the conundrum questions, apparently. What two kinds of experience or reflection happen in chapters 18 and 23 for Job? How are they characterized? Oh, nobody. Okay. Well,
Is it talking about like what he's reflecting on?
the type of reflection it
Is it
is, the
meditation?
quality of it.
Like meditation?
Mm.
Almost like deep thinking?
Well, he talks about the pillar of fire and
Yes.
the pillar of cloud.
There we go.
I mean, it's an interesting metaphor. But what it comes back to is how all through it, Job believes two things simultaneously. He believes two, I want to say contradictory, but I don't know, maybe the word is not, I mean, it's not the right word for it, but he believes two different things at the same time. He, on the one hand, you know, he says, I can't find God anywhere and I can't get justice. There is no justice. And then he turns around and says, but I expect justice from God. If I could just explain this to God, he would give me justice. And here, he's talking about what he calls the pillar of cloud is, at one point he says, God surrounds his throne with clouds so that we cannot see him. But he compares that to his statement, I know that my Redeemer liveth. So he, even though he can't see God, and he's looking for truth and he can't find truth, he still believes that it's there. So I guess those are the two kind of contradictory points of view that Job holds in his mind at the same time.
Yes. And it's the captured in that metaphor of the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. And these are both essential types of spiritual experience. And pillar of fire and pillar of cloud, if you'll recall from Exodus, are what accompany the children of Israel as they sojourn out of Egypt to Sinai. The pillar of fire, or pillar of cloud by day, and a pillar of fire by night. And of course, these have different symbolic meanings. Fire being that which purifies, that which illumines, which warms. Cloud being that which conceals, which shields from oppressive heat or burning sun, which provides sometimes rain. And so these two different metaphors are different kinds of experience with God. They're qualitatively different, and they lead to different kinds of reflection, and they elicit different kinds of spiritual experience, but both are necessary, both are important, both are valuable. And Job is having both of them. Chapter 18 was his pillar of fire experience, luminous, bright, warm, very clear. Chapter 22 is his cloud.
There's an interesting line in chapter 22, verse 12, 13, 14. Eliphaz takes that and turns it around. It's like he's deliberately misunderstanding what Job says. Job says, God hides his throne with clouds, meaning God hides his face from man. We can't see him. We have to make our actions based on faith without actually seeing God. But I want to see God. That's Job's point of view. But then Eliphaz turns around and says, God is in the heavenly heights. See the highest stars, how lofty. You say, what can God know? Can he govern through the dense cloud? The clouds screen him so he cannot see as he moves about the circuit of heaven. So it's like he's deliberately misunderstanding what Job was saying, and instead turning it into this notion that God doesn't really know what's going on because he can't see through the clouds.
Right. Which is another rhetorical trick called that's called the straw man fallacy. you repeat someone else's argument, but in a way that makes it flimsy and ridiculous, so that it makes it easy for you to knock it down. So we are not only learning something in this class about Job, we're learning something about rhetoric and argumentation and logic. Devious Father John. So, Job is having his pillar of cloud experience here in chapter 23. How does Job echo the psalmist's demonstration of what we already know about Job? Or to say the question as I wrote it down, how does Job's echo of the psalmist demonstrate what we already know about Job?
Okay. Like the psalmist, Job seeks God in every direction.
Like the psalmist, Job seeks God in every direction. And how and the quality of his seeking?
Well, he can't seem to find him.
But he's always probing.
He's probing, but he
He
can't quite
inquires, he asks.
get there.
And you recall a metaphor that Father Patrick used earlier, like a cook tasting food to see what recipes work best. You know, trying a little of this, adding a little of that, tasting it, testing to see what's going to be good. And of course, what good in this case would be what is true. Job is like the psalmist in this way. And this is simply, you have here an intertextual echo. Job is echoing the psalmist, or we probably would say later on, the psalmist is echoing Job. But like a photo positive of Job's, I can't find God anywhere, the psalmist finds him everywhere. The psalmist probably not having just been through Job's experience. So we see here that this scriptural back and forth, and it reflects the character of Job as we know him, one who is probing, one who is testing, one who is asking, one who is seeking God, not content with pat answers, nor offering himself pat answers, but deliberating, and particularly one who prays. You know, the Psalms are prayer expressions. They're prayerful expressions, hymns of all different kinds. Praise, lament, repentance, grief. And Job is expressing that same thing. These are prayerful expressions. So he's very much a man of prayer, which will become important.
Both times, though, he takes what the psalmist says and he turns it around and turns it into kind of a bitter expression of disappointment. The first one was, what is man that thou art mindful of him? Right? And Job's answer is, man is nothing, man is a worm. You know, so it's this very bitter, hopeless view, as opposed to the psalmist's view, which is man is this glorious creature that God pays attention to. And here he kind of does the same thing. He turns it around. The psalmist says, everywhere I look, God is there. And Job says, I'm looking and I'm looking, but I'm not finding him.
Is interesting. More interesting, perhaps, if you think that Job comes before the psalmist. And so the psalmist writes from the light of Job's experience, perhaps from his own experience, but writes with the whole arc of Job's story in view, as opposed to just this part of it where Job still doesn't know how things are going to play out.
Chronologically, the book of Job comes... I have trouble understanding that. It was written after the Psalms, or mostly the Psalms that he's quoting. The person who wrote Job, was familiar with the Psalms, I thought, or am I wrong with that?
Yeah, certainly the story is written down later.
Uh-huh.
But if we're talking about historical events, probably it happens before.
Oh, I see what you mean.
So as a historical event, Job probably precedes the psalmist. As a literary event, Job comes after the psalmist. Either way, you could. I think what you see with if the psalmist is able to incorporate Job into his sort of reflection on the scriptures, his reflection on God's interaction, then his confidence makes a lot more sense when you have Job's redemption in view. Either way, it is certainly the case that Job is working with a lot less light. And feels a lot less optimistic. But perhaps with good reason. Things have not been going especially well. How might Job's use of psalm language be instructive for us?
Can I try? Make a suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If Job is looking towards the Psalms in the midst of his suffering and trials, and Psalms are essentially expressions of prayer, even in his hardship, even in his humility, even in his loss, if he's looking to the Psalms for guidance and he's using that in the way that he speaks, it's almost a way in which we can also look to the Psalms in times of darkness and trouble, and where we need to find light and encouragement.
There's a reason that the Psalms are the church's prayer book, and have been since the very beginning. There was a time in the very early years of the church when there was a rule, a canon in place, I think in North Africa, that in order for a man to be considered for the office of bishop, he had to have memorized the Psalter. All of it. To this very day, it is the Psalter that's the backbone of our prayer books and of our services. There's no service without direct quotations from, readings from, or allusions to the book of the Psalms. And the language that the church employs for its own expressions of hope, faith, sorrow, grief are drawn heavily from the Psalter. This is why it's important in our own life to read the Psalter, or to be well enough acquainted with the services through attendance to have memorized at least some of the chapters of the Psalter. I say Psalm 50 twice every Sunday morning. Every time I start a liturgy, I am obliged to repeat the entire psalm twice. By now, I've got it.
Yeah.
It's in there. But what's interesting about that is that any time I need to access language that reflects that kind of experience, I have it. I don't have to come up with it. The more you internalize the Psalter, the more you have at your hand ready words that have been sanctified by immemorial use to express your soul. And I have never yet encountered a situation where what I had to say was superior to what the Psalter could say for me. Now, this doesn't mean that I don't talk to God in my own words. Sometimes your own little words are important. But when you need to express the deep feeling of your soul, nothing really does a better job of it, a more beautiful or profound job of it than the Psalms. So it's important, to the best of our ability, to try to memorize at least the ones that the church has put in the most prominent services, because you will find them useful in your own life of prayer, in your own life in general. When you are facing a failure, when you're facing the realization that you have sinned in a big way, having Psalm 50 at your fingertips is helpful. When you are rejoicing, having the Psalms at your fingertip is a really good thing. It gives you language. It gives you churchly vocabulary to express your soul. It's very powerful and very important.
This question about how might Job's use of Psalm language be instructive for us, it reminded me of, I can't remember what the subject of last week's little short sermon that you gave last Saturday was about, but
I can't either.
but what stuck with me was you were saying how there are cases where we have a choice between nourishing ourselves with beautiful stories and poisoning ourselves with the opposite. And this is exactly what's happening with Job here. Job knows the psalm, and he knows the notion that God is everywhere, and yet he's turning to this bitter interpretation, how I look everywhere for God, and he isn't anywhere to be found. So he has a choice, and just like with other elements in the story, he believes both things at once, and he has a choice of, am I going to believe A, or am I going to believe B? Am I going to choose the thing that will be nourishing to my soul, or am I going to choose the thoughts that will be poisonous to me? Oh, that's interesting.
Job cannot sort all of this out. And that's one of the things that I think makes this so good, is that the whole book so good, is that Job undoes the untrue and oversimple answers and worldview of his interlocutors. But Job doesn't have all the answers. He doesn't supply them himself. It isn't like he's the fount of all knowledge here. Job is a subject of profound grief and suffering, who in that space is trying to make sense of his relationship with God, trying to understand what it is that's happened to him. He knows what's not true, but he doesn't have all of the answers for what is true. But he continues to probe, and he continues to push forward, and he continues to call on God. And that willingness to be faithful in the space when the answers are not there, when everything is not clear, and when he's still hurting, is very, very powerful and very instructive for us, because all of us have been or will be there at some point in our lives. And when we are going through suffering, it's not always possible to make it make sense. Even if someone standing outside of it might be able to see and connect all the dots. Oh, here's why this is happening, and here's what's going on. It doesn't make sense as an experience. It's bewildering. And what Job is showing us is that in that space, there's this full range of emotion that he expresses. That like these different things that he believes at the same time that don't necessarily jibe or flow together real well, he also has this very strong conviction that God is real, God is just, God is going to vindicate him. And at the same time, God is not there, God has left me, he's abandoned me, he's forsaken me, I wish I was dead. All of this exists in him at once, which is what it's like to be in a state of profound suffering and grief. All of this happens in him at once. And I said this before, it's really important. One of the things that's instructive here is that while he gives full vent to those feelings of hopefulness and sadness, he never lets go of the conviction that he has that God is real and that God is there. He never overthrows what he believes based on what he feels. He also never stops allowing himself to have the feelings because he believes something. All of this exists in him in one giant jungle of a mess. And it's going to be God and not Job that comes and sorts things out. And that's something to file away in your own brain ball. Anything else on chapter 23? Moving on to chapter 24, what distinguishes Job from the contemporary atheist who makes the same criticism of theodicy Job makes?
says that Kant believes goodness and good fortune should go together, whereas Job believes goodness and good fortune are not always going together, but God is all-knowing.
How does he know that?
Because he's Job.
And what does Job have? More than his comforters have.
Trust.
Not trust. Well, he does have trust, but what's the trust based on? What's trust based on in any relationship?
Faith.
All right, he believes God is his friend.
A healthy
Okay.
relationship.
He believes God is his friend.
That's right.
And throughout this, we get a sense that Job has had a profound, lifelong experience with God. And so Job is able to probe these questions without having anything to replace them with. He's able to undermine the moral order as it's presented to him without having an answer, without at the same time saying, if I can't answer the question, therefore God must not exist. All this must be a fantasy. And it's because he has a profound personal experience of God that doesn't necessarily provide him with the answers to all the questions, but gives him an anchor in the midst of all the questions. And that's the difference. Job has an anchor, and that anchor does not give him the answers to all the questions. He doesn't guarantee that he has a ready solution for every problem that comes up, particularly thorny ones like the problem of suffering, and the suffering of the righteous or the good or the innocent. But in the midst of that, because of that experience, he has something that he knows personally that allows him not to be blown away by it, to be crushed by it, utterly.
See, in listening to you talk about Job and listening to you talk about his interlocutors and listening to you talk about contemporary atheism and so forth, it makes sense that a lot of this has to do with the pragmatic theory of knowledge of I am living and this is my surrounding because it fits what I want. You talk about why people go into fallacies. People use fallacies when their understanding of the world and their experiences around them break from their pragmatic understanding of what they're experiencing in the world. This is the world, this is where I live, this is how it is because it works for me. It's pragmatism. And you have these people going to Job, and when their argument starts to break down, it starts to break from what they know and what seems to work for them in their lives. Job is being very honest about how he's feeling. He's not necessarily condemning. He's simply expressing and exploring the ways that he's feeling based on his suffering. So this is the good, this is my positive experience with God, this is the negative, this is my suffering and how I hurt. But like you said, there's an anchor. The contemporary atheist looks at this suffering so as to justify atheism, so as to justify the behaviors and pragmatism that surround a life that orients around not having God as part of that life. Job looks at his suffering and his experience and so forth to justify his experience, but to do so in a way that still acknowledges and recognizes God. So we know God, and he knows and believes in God and his friendship with God, and so he's going to have that contextual lens by which to see his suffering. The contemporary atheist most likely does not. The contemporary atheist looks at their life in the world and sees it through a lens of science, through their pragmatic understanding of the reason of their existence. If you don't have that foundation, you don't have that friendship with Job, with God that Job has, then where does your experience of suffering lead you? With many people in contemporary atheism, it leads towards further doubt.
But where does the information come from to tell us that Job has had a past experience of God, that he has? How do we know that? Where does that?
Well, he calls him his friend. And when God speaks of Job to Satan, he speaks of one whom he regards very highly.
But Job doesn't know that. Job hasn't met God yet. I mean, he
Not in the way that he's going to meet him, right?
That's right.
But it's clear from the way he speaks about God that he has an experience of God that allows him to hold on to these verities in the face of what he is facing.
But it may be that until he experienced all of this adversity, he thought of things the same way as his comforters did. He said, you know, I have a pretty good life here, and this is because I'm doing what God wants me to do. He didn't. I mean, we don't know that he had any direct experience of God, that he had a conversation or a vision like Eliphaz did. I don't know that there's any personal experience of God that he can rely on that makes him believe this. I guess he believes it for the same reason as Bildad, that this is what he was taught by his elders, you know.
Could be. It could be. Job in general seems to have profounder insights, however limited they are, than his comforters do, regarding his intuition regarding the resurrection of the dead, his probing of the mystery of suffering, questions of justice, his absolute confidence in the faithfulness of God. And in general, it could be something that he learned, that he was taught. My own experience suggests that when one is in tremendous pain, it isn't one's ideas so much as that one is able to hold on to as much as it is what one has experienced oneself. What one knows in a less discursive way of knowing. But that doesn't have to mean that Job that God walked with Job in the cool of the day like Adam in a garden, that he literally talked to him, but that over time that he had a strong sense of God's presence, of God's goodness, God's faithfulness that developed in him as he worshipped him and served him. So it isn't necessarily that Job had a kind of face-to-face encounter with God sometime in the past, but merely that in his continual interaction and worship of God, he developed a profounder sense of him than his comforters had, that allows him to think of God as a friend and not simply as an impersonal force. Where does Job's argument leave us?
I look confused.
Confused.
I guess that's probably not the right answer.
I think it's probably as good an answer as any. Because Job's argument doesn't offer a solution. It leaves us in a state where what Job has basically said, Job's comforters have said, this happened because you did wrong, and God is punishing you because God punishes the unjust, and he rewards the righteous. End of story. And Job said, well, wait a minute now. In the first place, I haven't done anything wrong, so I'm not unrighteous, and I'm not being punished because I've done something wrong. But let's just take me out of the equation for a minute. We can all think of situations where someone righteous has suffered tragedy, and where someone unrighteous has reaped the benefits that we call being blessed by God. Healthy children, rich crops, good cattle, all of this kind of stuff. So if that's the case, then how does your argument even make sense? But that's... okay, your argument doesn't make any sense, and it's no good. Okay, well, how do we want to explain it then? Well, I don't know. Well, that's where he's left us. He's left us at this place where we are not being offered an alternative intellectual system of rules that will allow us to predict in advance how God is going to behave and how things are going to play out for the righteous and the unrighteous. We're left waiting for an answer, waiting for some solution, waiting to be brought out of this morass that now we discover, to our perhaps chagrin, we're sitting in with him because we don't have the answers to this question. So Job's argument leaves us just as much in the dark as he is. And as a reader, that's where you're supposed to be. Why?
If you're exploring his suffering and his experience, that's where he is. If reading Job and reading his life and his experience and his suffering is supposed to convey onto us what he's going through, that's the state of mind that he's in. That's where you discussed it. That suffering, real, true suffering, leaves you in that place of confusion. You talked about the fire and the cloud, this kind of duplicity back and forth that he's not able to reconcile yet, that he will reconcile in his conversation with God. If this is where he is in the course of his suffering, this is how we're supposed to perceive that honest reflection as we read through it.
Certainly, in terms of getting into the skin of Job in the book, that's this is a very effective way of getting us into the same place he is, where we don't have an answer to the problem. There's something happening on a much different level, on a really sort of a high theological level. There's a point that's being made, that's going to be made really explicitly in the New Testament. When Jesus is resurrected and is walking on the road to Emmaus with Luke and Cleopas, what happens? Do Luke and Cleopas know who he is?
They don't recognize him.
They don't recognize him. When do they? And what does he do on the road?
He breaks bread.
Well, on the road, he opens the Scriptures and shows through the Scriptures how the Messiah must suffer and must die. And then they get to their location while he's still instructing them from the Scriptures. They ask him to stay, and they sit down, and he gives thanks for the bread and breaks it and gives it to them. And in that moment, they see him for who he is, and then he disappears from their sight. Now go back to the gospel reading from last Sunday, the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man is suffering, and he calls out, Father Abraham, please grant Lazarus to come and dip some water on his finger and put it on my tongue. And he says, can't happen. And he says, well, I've got 5 brothers back at my house. Please send him there to warn them so they don't end up here too. And what does Abraham say to him?
Says, you have the law and the prophets, and that's enough.
And if you don't hear them,
Even if a man returned from the dead, they still would not change their ways.
what's happening here on a higher theological level that's only going to be unfolded as the New Testament comes into shape is the reality that insight, true theological insight, an understanding of the way things really are, the revelation of God himself is a revelation. It's a theophany. It's not something that one can acquire through sense experience or by purely rational discourse. One cannot truly encounter God by reasoning one's way toward him. One cannot encounter God by picking up a book. One can encounter lots of ideas about God, concepts about God, even true statements about God. But one cannot encounter God himself in this way. They only knew, so he opened the scriptures to them and showed how they spoke about him, but they only knew him in the breaking of the bread. It was a revelation. And so what's going to have to happen here, we're in the dark. is that God is going to have to reveal himself. And whatever answer we get is going to be the answer that we get from his self-disclosure. And that's what we have, is in the revelation of God himself. But it doesn't always, it doesn't always map neatly onto our desires and expectations for discursive and rational knowledge. It can speak to us in far different and more profound ways, but it won't always satisfy that. But what we see is you have a proto-version of that happening here. Does that make sense? Okay, we didn't have much on 25 anyway. Bildad's sudden and inelegant silence. In chapter 25, when Bildad splutters out the first part of an argument and then kind of stops. What does it suggest to you?
He's not willing to listen to any more argument. He's saying, this is the way it is, I have nothing more to say. Shuts down.
Right. He doesn't even have the strength to repeat his whole argument again. It's like Job's questions have put an end to the discussion. What else is there to say here?
Because they're very uncomfortable questions.
They are very
You can see
uncomfortable
how a
questions.
person might react that way. Lots of people do. They don't want to ask these questions. It's all very uncomfortable stuff.
And no easy answers present themselves. We'll get to that next time. So for the next time, we've gone through 25. Let's go through 31. Can we do that? And like this time, we'll do just one or two questions on each chapter. And we'll go through chapter 31. Okay?
That's great.
Okey-dokey.
All right. God bless you all. Talk to you later.